Bleak House by Charles Dickens, Chapter 39, Attorney and Client. The name of Mr. Vholes, preceded by the legend ground floor, is inscribed upon a doorpost in Simon's Inn, Chancery Lane, a little pale, wall-eyed, woe-begone inn, like a large dustbin of 2 compartments and a sifter. Mr. Vholes's office, in disposition retiring, and in situation retired, is squeezed up in a corner and blinks at a dead wall. 3 feet of knotty-floored dark passage bring the client to Mr. Vholes's jet-black door, in an angle profoundly dark in the brightest midsummer morning. Mr. Vholes's chambers are on so small a scale that one clerk can open the door without getting off his stool, while the other, who elbows him at the same desk, has equal facilities for poking the fire. The place was last painted or whitewashed beyond the memory of man, and the 2 chimneys smoke, and there is a loose outer surface of soot everywhere, and the dull cracked windows in their heavy frames have but one piece of character in them, which is a determination to be always dirty and always shut, unless coerced. Mr. Vholes is a very respectable man. He has not a large business, but he is a very respectable man. He is allowed by the greater attorneys who have made good fortunes or are making them to be a most respectable man. He never misses a chance in his practice, which is a mark of respectability. He never takes any pleasure, which is another mark of respectability. He is reserved and serious, which is another mark of respectability. His digestion is impaired, which is highly respectable. And he is making hay of grass, which is flesh, for his 3 daughters, and his father is dependent on him in the Vale of Taunton. The one great principle of the English law is to make business for itself. There is no other principle distinctly, certainly, and consistently maintained through all its narrow turnings. Viewed by this light, it becomes a coherent scheme, and not the monstrous maze the laity are apt to think it. Let them but once clearly perceive that its grand principle is to make itself for business at their expense, and surely they will cease to grumble. The Chancery is, within these 10 minutes, up for a long vacation. Mr. Vholes and his young client, and several blue bags hastily stuffed, out of all regularity of form, as the larger sort of serpents are in their first gorged state, have returned to the official den. Mr. Vholes, quiet and unmoved as a man of so much respectability ought to be, takes off his close black gloves as if he were skinning his hands, lifts off his tight hat as if he were scalping himself, and sits down at his desk. The client throws his hat and gloves upon the ground, tosses them anywhere without looking after them or caring where they go, flings himself into a chair, half sighing and half groaning, rests his aching head upon his hand, and looks the portrait of young despair. "Again, nothing," says Richard. "Nothing done."
"Don't say nothing done, sir,"
returns the placid Vholes.
"That is scarcely fair, sir, scarcely fair."
"Why, what is done?" says Richard, turning gloomily upon him.
"That may not be the whole question,"
returns Vholes. I'm going to stop doing Vholes's voice that way.
"The question may branch off into what is doing and what is doing."
"And what is doing?" asks the moody client. Vholes, sitting with his arms on his desk and fixedly and slowly looking at his client, replies,
"A good deal is doing, sir. We have put our shoulders to the wheel, Mr. Carstone, and the wheel is going round."
"Yes, with Ixon on it. How am I to get through the next 4 or 5 accursed months?" exclaims the young man, rising from his chair and walking about the room.
"Mr. C,"
returns Vholes, following him close with his eyes wherever he goes,
"your spirits are hasty, and I am sorry for it on your account. Excuse me if I recommend you not to chafe so much, not to be so impetuous, nor to wear yourself out so. You should have more patience. You should sustain yourself better.
I ought to imitate you, in fact, Mr. Vholes," says Richard, sitting down with an impatient laugh, and beating the devil's tattoo with his boot on the patternless carpet.
Sir,
returns Voles with an inward manner of speech and his bloodless quietude.
I should not have had the presumption to propose myself as a model for your imitation or any man's. Let me but leave my good name to my 3 daughters, and that is enough for me. I am not a self-seeker, but since you mention me so pointedly, I will acknowledge that I should like to impart to you a little of my... Come, sir, you are disposed to call it sensitivity. Say a little of my insensibility.
Mr. Voles, explains the client, somewhat abashed, I had no intention to accuse you of insensibility.
I think you had, sir, without knowing it,
returns the equable Voles.
Very naturally, it is my duty to attend to your interests with a cool head, and I can quite understand that to your excited feelings I may appear, at such times as the present, insensible. Not that I complain, sir, of the eye of business being distrustful. Quite the contrary. In attending to your interests, I wish to have all possible checks upon me. It is right that I should have them. I court inquiry, but your interests demand that I should be cool and methodical, Mr. Carstone. I cannot be otherwise. No, sir, not even to please you.
Mr. Voles, after glancing at the official cat, who is patiently watching a mouse's hole, fixes his charmed gaze again on his young client and proceeds with his buttoned-up, half-audible voice.
What are you to do, sir? You inquire during the vacation. I should hope you, gentlemen of the army, may find many means of amusing yourselves. If you give your minds to it, if you had asked me what I was to do during the vacation, I could have answered you more readily. I am to attend to your interests. I am to be found here day by day, attending to your interests. That is my duty, Mr. C., and term time or vacation makes no difference to me. If you wish to consult me as to your interests, you will find me here at all times alike. Other professional men go out of town. I don't. This desk is your rock, sir.
Mr. Voles gives it a rap, and it sounds as hollow as a coffin. Not to Richard, though. There is encouragement in the sound. There is encouragement in the sound to him. Perhaps Mr. Voles knows there is.
I am perfectly aware, Mr. Voles,
says Richard, more familiarly and good-humoredly, that you are the most reliable fellow in the world, and that to have to do with you is to have to do with a man of business who is not to be hoodwinked. But put yourself in my case, dragging on this dislocated life, sinking despair, and deeper into difficulty every day, continually hoping and continually disappointed, conscious of change upon change for the worse in myself and of no change for the better in anything else. And you will find it in a dark-looking case sometime, as I do.
You know, says Mr. Voles, that I give hope, sir. I told you from the first, Mr. C., that I never give hopes, particularly in a case like this, where the greater part of the cost comes out of the estate. I should not be considerate of my good name if I gave hopes. It may seem as if costs were my subject. Still, when you say there is no change for that better, I must, as a bare matter of fact, deny that.
I? Said Richard, brightening.
But how do you make it out? Mr. Carstone, you are separately represented, and no longer hidden and lost in the interests of others. That's something. The suit does not sleep. We wake it up, we air it, we walk it about. That's something. It's not all jaundice, in fact as well as name. That's something. Nobody has it all his own way now, sir, and that's something, surely.
Richard, his face flushed suddenly, strikes the desk with his clenched hand. Mr. Voles, if any man had told me when I first went to John Jarndyce's house that he was anything but the disinterested friend he seems, that he was what he gradually turned out to be, I could have found no words strong enough to repel the slander. I could not have defended him too ardently. So little did I know of the world, whereas now I do declare to you that he becomes to me the embodiment of the suit. that in place of its being an abstraction, it is John Jarndyce, that the more I suffer, the more indignant I am with him, that every new delay and every new disappointment is only a new injury from John Jarndyce's hand." "No," says Vholes, "don't say so. We ought to have patience, all of us. Besides, I never disparage, sir, I never disparage." "Mr. Vholes," returns the angry client, "you know as well as I do that he would have strangled the suit if he could." "He was not active in it," Mr. Vholes admits, with an appearance of reluctance. "He certainly was not active in it. However, he might have had amiable intentions. Who can read the heart, Mr. C?" "You can," returns Richard, "well enough to know that his intentions were and are not our interests conflicting." "Tell me that," says Richard, accompanying the last three words with 3 raps on his rock of trust. And let's do that again. "Tell me that." "Mr. C," returns Mr. Vholes, immovable with an attitude and never winking his hungry eyes, "I should be wanting in my duty as your professional adviser. I should be departing from my fidelity to your interests if I represented those interests as identical with the interests of Mr. Jarndyce. They are no such thing, sir. I never impugn motives, but I must not shrink from a professional duty, even if it sows dissensions in families. I understand you to be now consulting me professionally as to your interests. You are so, I reply then. They are not identical with those of Mr. Jarndyce." "Of course they are not," cries Richard. "You found that out long ago." "Mr. C," returns Mr. Vholes, "I wish to say no more of any third party than is necessary. I wish to leave my good name unsullied, together with any little property of which I may become possessed, through industry and perseverance, to my daughters Emma, Jane, and Caroline. I desire to live in amity with my professional brethren. When Mr. Skimpole did me the honour, sir, of bringing us together in this room, I mentioned to you that I could offer no opinion or advice as to your interests while those interests were entrusted to another member of the profession, and I spoke in such terms as I was bound to speak of Kenj & Carboy's office, which stands high. You, sir, thought fit to withdraw your interests from that keeping nevertheless, and to offer them to me. You brought them with clean hands, sir, and I accepted them with clean hands. The interests are now paramount in this office. I shall not rest, sir, while I am your representative. Whenever you want me, you will find me here. Summon me anywhere, and I will come. During the long vacation, sir, I shall devote my leisure to studying your interests more and more closely, and to making arrangements for moving heaven and earth, including, of course, the Chancellor, after Michaelmas term. And when I ultimately congratulate you, sir, says Mr. Vholes with the severity of a determined man, when I ultimately congratulate you, sir, with all my heart on your ascension to fortune, you will owe me nothing beyond whatever little balance may be then outstanding of the costs as between solicitor and client, not included in the taxed costs allowed out of the estate. My duty prosperously ended, all between us is ended. Vholes finally adds, by way of rider, to this declaration of his principles, that as Mr. Carstone is about to rejoin his regiment, perhaps Mr. C will favour him with an order on his agent for £20 on account. The client, with his dejection insensibly relieved, and his vague hopes rekindled, takes pen and ink and writes the draft, not without perplexed consideration and calculation of the date it may bear, implying scant efforts in the agent's hands. All the while, Vholes, buttoned up in body and mind, looks at him attentively. All the while, Vholes's official cat watches the mouse's hole. Thus they part, and Vholes, left alone, employs himself in carrying sundry little matters out of his diary into his draft bill book, for the ultimate behoof of his 3 daughters. Richard, emerging from the heavy shade of Simon's Inn into the sunshine of Chancery Lane, for there happens to be sunshine there today, walks thoughtfully on, and turns into Lincoln's Inn and passes under the shadow of the Lincoln's Inn trees. On many such lounges have the speckled shadows of those trees often fallen. On the like bent head and the bitten nail, the lowering eye, the lingering step, the purposeless and dreamy air, the good consuming and the consumed, the life turned sour. This lounger is not shabby yet. but that may come. Chancery which knows no wisdom, but in precedent is very rich in such precedents, and why should one be different from 10,000? Yet the time is so short since his depreciation began, that as he saunters away, reluctant to leave the spot for some long months together, though he hates it, Richard himself may feel his own case as if it were a startling one. While his heart is heavy with corroding care, suspense and distrust and doubt, it may have room for some sorrowful wonder when he recalls how different his first visit there, how different all the colors of his mind. But injustice breeds injustice. The fighting with shadows and being defeated by them necessitates the setting up of substances to combat from an impalpable suit, which no man alive can understand, the time for that being long gone by. It has become a gloomy relief to turn to the palpable figure of his friend who would have saved him from this ruin, and make him his enemy. Richard has told Voles the truth. Is he in a hardened or a softened mood? He still lays his injuries equally at that door. He is thwarted in that quarter of a set purpose, and that purpose could only originate in the one subject that is resolving his existence into itself. Besides, it is a justification to him in his own eyes to have an embodied antagonist, an oppressor. Is Richard a monster in all this? Or would Chancery be found rich in such precedents too, if they could be got for citation from the recording angel? And we will pause there.